Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody to IT Martini Hour 13. Thank you very much for sharing a part of your evening with us today. Today we're pleased to have a great panel of IT security professionals to talk to you a little bit about kind of security in 2010 and beyond. Application security, is that important? And if so, why?
I'd say yes, application security is important because if you look at the compromised data from sources like Ponemon and the Verizon breach report, it clearly shows that attackers do focus on the application layer, and a majority of breached records do occur from attacks like SQL injection, cross-site scripting. But I guess what I would point out even more of as an emerging threat vector is not just traditional web applications that many of you are probably working with and testing today by now, hopefully in your environment. But I would also point out that a number of client-server applications, embedded applications, mobile applications, those have now become common gateways of compromise as well, and they're well within the attacker's per diem. So those should be in your test plans as well.
And so that application security matters to the degree that the data behind the application matter. So if you've got an application of absolutely no consequence, then no. Application security doesn't matter.
Nobody has those.
The critical thing is really about the data, about the impact on the organization, and what will happen in the event that something bad does in fact happen.
It matters both, from a technical basis and from is the data important? But if I'm going to build an application, most times the business side and the development side aren't talking to the security side. And so we get involved in a lot of projects at the tail end. When the application's been built, the risk has been taken by the business, but they've not adequately dealt with the fact that they're exposing critical data, as Matt said, or they've built a business without a foundation to secure it.
When the phones ring at your companies, what kind of calls are coming in? What kind of concerns are out there, in really 2010, and what would you foresee happening as we move into 2011 as far as those concerns on a business's mind?
I think the first set of calls that we receive all too often are folks calling after they've been hacked or they've had an incident. And I think a lot of that, by the time we trace it back, it just turns out that a lot of folks aren't doing the basics very well, or they're not doing the basics at all. And I think that's the primary thing that we see.
Yeah, I agree. I think a lot of organizations aren't doing the basics very well. And if you think about it, when these events break loose, at least in my experience, invariably it's because there was some violation of expectation or policy.
There are two universal constants. Number one is that computer systems fail. Universal constant number two is that people make mistakes. We have organizations that continue to build systems and people that go about their business failing to recognize these universal constants. So we build systems and we maintain processes that are brittle. So as soon as anything that they didn't anticipate happens, everything falls over and it's a complete failure. That's the kind of thing that leads people then to go from absolute complacency to absolute panic.
I think we all get those kind of calls, and they probably get some of the same kind of calls as we get as well, which is we've had a customer ask, are we securing the data right? And the call's not coming from the network side or the IT side. It's the CEO or the chief sales officer, somebody in the sales department that's promised something to a customer, but technically the company can't meet it. And so more and more compliance is becoming a union card for can I do business with somebody upstream? And we're getting as many of those calls today as we were broken into because we didn't follow the basics.
So give us some sense of some ideas that a company can take to improve their security posture overall.
What I see when I sit down with my the clients that I work with is three things typically missing. One is visibility. If you sit down and you ask someone, how much visibility do you have into your network perimeter? In other words, do you know about all your points of presence? Do you know what their value liability characteristics are? What's at stake for each of those points of presence? And do you know what the control conditions are? And if you ask them that question about the whole of their perimeter, typically what they end up telling you is, well, gee, we can answer one out of three of those questions, maybe two, but unless you can answer all three about your perimeter, you don't have good visibility.
I think one of the things I'd like to add to that, to what Jack said, is that humans are worse at risk assessment and management than we think. Everybody here thinks that they're better at risk assessment than they are. Now, in your prehistoric time, you were confronted with a predator and you knew to either fight or flee. But today, those incidents occur so infrequently that a lot of what you take to be as an innate capability has kind of degraded over time. So I would urge a lot of you to kind of take a gut check and think about that in not just information security, but in the rest of your life as well. Are you as good and as vigilant about risk management in a whole as you believe that you are?
The information security profession, as individuals operating in our personal lives, we probably have a better, at least an average perspective on risk. But then you put us into a workplace environment where we're being asked about, how much risk do we have in our organization, that sort of thing. And we tend to fall back on a whole lot of myth, dogma, and misperception about risk that's rampant in the security industry that gets in the way of us doing a good job.
People don't spend enough time looking at the landscape. They'll find a thing and they go, aha, this happened. That's bad. You're screwed. And then that's it. We don't look at things and put them in context and say, you know what, we've got an issue over here. We can put our attention over here and then get this area of weakness up to the same level that these other 99 areas of strength that we have are.
So I think step number one is you have to know what it is that you have and how you want to protect it. It's visibility. And then the second thing is you can absolutely learn about the people who are after you. You can learn about your enemy. Today, a number of mechanisms exist to both quantify and qualify threats and the capabilities of folks that are out to get you.
We're not very good as individuals at assessing risk. As organizations, I think one of the things, though, is we're not very good about talking about it. How many of you are here from the business side of your company? Your salesperson, your management, how many are technical? Mostly technical, at least up here in the front row. The business guys are closer to the bar. The essence is, if we go back to what Matt was saying, in terms of we kind of traverse through life and we bounce around these risks, IT's bouncing around one set of risks, and what they're worried about, their boogeyman or the monster that's real, is different than the business side. And a lot of times what we see is we're not talking between those two groups. There's a jargon gap, and IT sometimes gets fixated on one piece, but the risk that they're trying to manage is a technical risk, and it contradicts, or the efforts to fight that contradict the risk of the business side, which is the competitor down the street, not the person trying to break into the computer that's sitting in Lithuania. And we have to come together, and we just don't do that very well today.
Information security is very often seen as something that's a subset of IT. The fact is, most of us don't go to school to study algorithms and data structures because we're good at dealing with people. So we wind up with a problem where the people that have the ability to look at the mechanism and to understand implications are not willing or are not capable of going out and talking to the other stakeholders. And so we wind up with this issue where not only do we have the inability to communicate, but back to the incentives thing, who in IT security is really feeling like they're getting ahead by going and attending 4-hour meetings.
More and more press today is the cloud, right? This new invention of the cloud that we've all known about in other nomenclature. And we're now seeing business units, with or without IT's permission, exploring, maybe I just build my new application on the cloud. Right, so let's talk a little bit about, as organizations assess the cloud and its viability, does that bring new security concerns into the organization, right, in this virtualized environment?
I think fundamentally, no. The basic issues, if we go back to the fundamental tenets of information security, we are worried about things like confidentiality, integrity, availability, and some other properties that we can provide to business processes. So the answer is no. Now the mechanism may be somewhat different. That is, the implementation, the mechanism is actually probably the same. I mean, the fact is we're still pushing around IPv4 packets that have been around for decades. We're still, communicating everything in ASCII, which was standardized in 1963. This is not new stuff. And so I think that the real question just becomes, how do we make sure that we don't get so enamored by, what color the application is today, that we, lose our minds and think that everything we know up to this point is irrelevant.
If you're dealing with a cloud vendor, all right, or if you're looking at cloud vendors and you have decent visibility into their operations and their security, and they have sufficient incentive, it seems to me like you could be pretty confident, probably at least as confident as you would be with your own organization, if you had decent visibility and decent incentives.
So you mentioned the cloud, and you talked about incentive. So, the cloud providers have incentive to protect our data, maybe even more so than our own companies, because they want to stay in business, right? But don't the hackers have more incentive to attack the cloud because there's so much, there could be so much out there? The attackers are still attacking, if you think about it, across the internet, and if they find that weak spot in your IT shop versus in the cloud provider, it's an easier target, and from that standpoint, it's a logical perception, but from that standpoint, it doesn't work. The incentives for some of these cloud providers, there's one that I forget the name of it. It was a healthcare application, software as a service based in Washington State. And from the time they were broken into till the time they were closed, their venture funding came out, was a matter of about 3 or 4 days. So the incentives are death for some of these companies. And from that standpoint, if they're doing it correctly, their investment into securing it goes far beyond what the typical firm that we're dealing with is doing today.
That said, I completely agree, but don't confuse yourself. Aggregation of data in one location, the density of data certainly makes for a richer target. Attackers aren't stupid. Criminals are good at crime, and they're going to go where the money is. However, if you handle that risk appropriately, for example, if all the data that you ship up into the cloud is encrypted in transit and in storage, it may not matter if they actually get the data. So if you manage the risk appropriately of the process, and you come back to what Jack said, you actually plan for those kinds of failures, that may not be a catastrophic risk that it appears to be.
Yeah, and the two basic issues there are going to be the impact of that kind of scenario, and if you don't have these other controls to limit the impact, then yeah, you have a larger impact. On the other hand, you also have the likelihood, and the fact is you are better at dealing with something that you encounter every day than somebody else who encounters it once a month or once a year or once every 10 years. So in that regard, having a place where everybody's hitting it all the time actually is counterintuitively may in fact make it a stronger place to keep it.
The other thing I'll point out is the criminals are like any other business, essentially. They're looking for a return on investment, right, in terms of the time and effort and risk that they face and in the actions they take. They're looking for, if they can get what they're after easier, they're going to go that way. They're not looking to knock down Fort Knox if they don't have to.
But I would like to thank all of these gentlemen for participating tonight. So.